In the span of only a few months, OLED has flooded the world of gaming monitors, but there are really two displays that stand on the shoulders of the rest. Alienware's 34 QD-OLED and LG's UltraGear OLED 27. They're both fantastic monitors, and honestly, you could pick either of them and have a great experience, but there are some important differences between them. I've used both monitors extensively, and I'll get this out of the way up front. For me, the Alienware 34 QD-OLED is the way to go. But that's largely because of how I use my monitor, and the LG OLED 27 still has some unique advantages of its own. So, which should you buy? Let's get into it. But hold up, before we do, I'm gonna ask you kindly to hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video. Like, you don't have to, but it would be really cool if you did. Let's start with the pricing discussion because a lot has changed with these monitors. There would be a pretty large gap in price between the UltraGear OLED 27 and the 34 QD-OLED if Alienware hadn't given its display a mid-gen refresh. At the time I'm recording this, you can get both monitors for the exact same price, $1,000. There's a little more to the pricing though. For starters, $1,000 is the price for the Alienware AW3423DWF, or the FreeSync version of the 34 QD-OLED. The original version comes with G-Sync Ultimate and it's $1,300. Otherwise, the two displays are very similar. The G-Sync version has a slightly faster 175 Hz refresh rate, while the FreeSync model is limited to 165 Hz. Honestly, the vast majority of people are fine with the FreeSync version. You can find variable refresh rate for both NVIDIA and AMD GPUs, so the extra $300 is going to the G-Sync Ultimate module inside the display. This G-Sync module apparently offers some minor advantages if you pair with an NVIDIA GPU, but they don't really matter when $300 on the table. For the purposes of this comparison, the monitors are identical. $1,000 is the cheapest I've seen the FreeSync version, though it occasionally goes for $1,100. The UltraGear OLED 27 goes in the opposite direction. It lists for $1,000, but I've seen open box and refurbished models for as little as $750. For the purposes of this comparison, they're the same price. That said, you can spend a little more on the Alienware, or if you're on a tight budget and you still want an OLED panel, the LG model is available for cheaper if you shop around a little bit. All right, so for that $1,000, what are you getting? The UltraGear OLED 27 is a 27-inch 1440p monitor. According to LG specs, it has a typical brightness of 200 nits and a peak brightness of 1000 nits, along with a contrast ratio of 1.5 million to 1. That contrast ratio spec is kind of irrelevant though. OLED has perfect black levels, so you're theoretically getting an infinite contrast ratio. The big distinction is that it's a 27-inch 16:9 monitor with a 240 Hz refresh rate. The Alienware 34 QD-OLED is a 34-inch 21:9 monitor with a 165 Hz refresh rate, or 175 Hz if you pick up the G-Sync model. That 21:9 aspect ratio is commonly known as ultra-wide, pushing out the sides for more horizontal screen real estate. It has a slightly higher resolution, 3440 by 1440, but it's basically 1440p with more on the sides. Due to the fact that it's an ultra-wide display, Alienware includes a very slight 1800R curve. I actually really like how subtle it is, much unlike the 800R curve we see on something like the UltraGear OLED 45. There's a very important difference between the monitors outside of the specs too. They're both OLED, but the Alienware 34 uses a QD-OLED panel while the LG is straight OLED. It's technically MLA OLED, but we don't need to get into all that right now. Caleb has an explainer on what QD-OLED is, so make sure to watch that if you want an in-depth look. The short explanation though is that QD-OLED includes a layer of quantum dots in front of the OLED panel, bypassing the need for a color filter that traditional OLED needs to produce colors. That color filter saps OLED of brightness, which is why OLED monitors and TVs are often so much dimmer than most LCD displays. QD-OLED is supposed to be a best of both worlds type of display, offering solid brightness while still using that silky OLED backbone. And that theory mostly holds up based on our testing, at least between these two monitors. The LG display could barely hold 200 nits, peaking at less than 250 nits when fully cranked. LG claims the monitor can hit 1000 nits for 3% of the screen, but I measured just below 600 nits for 3% of the screen. The Alienware 34 QD-OLED isn't much brighter, but it's definitely brighter. Typical brightness is somewhere around 300 nits, and it can crack that 1000 nit barrier in HDR for 3% of the screen. Now, it might sound like there's a big difference, but it's much smaller than you might suspect. Using the two monitors, the Alienware is at a comfortable level of brightness, while the LG feels just a little dim by comparison. It's certainly not unusable though, unlike I've seen some Reddit comments suggest. On the brightness front, LG isn't your only option. I've also reviewed ASUS's take on this panel, the PG27AQ-DM, and it gets much better brightness out of the exact same panel. So there are definitely alternatives to the UltraGear OLED 27 that get the brightness up to par. Corsair also has its Xeneon OLED 27, but unfortunately I haven't had a chance to test that display. Outside of brightness, both monitors are fairly color accurate. Out of the box in SDR, the LG was a little more accurate based on our testing, with a color error of 1.5. The Alienware really isn't that far behind though. It has an error of 1.9 overall, particularly due to some issues with the greens that you could easily correct with a colorimeter like the Spider X. I gotta be honest though, neither is really a great option for intense color work. They both offer great color coverage, 97% of DCI-P3 for the LG and 95% for the Alienware, but they really throw accuracy out the window at higher brightness. Due to the way these monitors increase brightness, colors start to desaturate as the brightness increases, making them less accurate. For instance, the LG monitor had a color error of over 6 in HDR. You can do some light photo or video editing work in SDR, but there are really better options if that's your main priority. Make no mistake, these are media consumption monitors, not media creation monitors. And they succeed on that front. Both OLED and QD-OLED provide exceptional color and contrast, and if you play a game like Cyberpunk 2077 or Destiny 2 on either display with HDR turned on, honestly, it's really hard going back. But if you frequently watch this channel, you probably already knew that. And there are some important differences between the two displays when it comes to gaming. First and foremost, the refresh rate. Now, the difference between 165 Hz and 240 Hz is a lot smaller in practice than it is on paper, but it's not totally irrelevant. It's a difference in feel, not necessarily in the smoothness you see. Like, yes, there is a difference in smoothness, but it's just not super significant. The main advantage of having something like a 240 Hz refresh rate is when you have a main game, one that you're perfectly attuned to and you can play like you're riding a bike. A 240 Hz refresh rate isn't going to make you better, but it might give you a little edge when you feel like you could play better. I'll give you an example. So Overwatch 2 is a game I could play on a 240 Hz refresh rate and feel that difference. But if I was playing Counter-Strike Global Offensive, which is a game I don't play very often, I'd have a hard time telling between 144 Hz, 165 Hz, and 240 Hz. This is an important discussion because the type of games you play factors heavily into the buying decision between these two monitors. The Alienware 34QD OLED is a good all-arounder with a fast refresh rate that looks good across the board. The LG looks good across the board too, but the main advantage of that higher refresh rate really shows up when you have a main game that you return to over and over again. Either way though, these are two of the fastest monitors you can buy, not only due to the fact that they have high refresh rates, but also due to the fact that they use OLED. OLED has super fast response times, so although that 34QD OLED has a slower refresh rate, you can definitely take it out in competitive games without having any issues. Refresh rate isn't the only thing to consider here. The aspect ratio is very important as well, and the script flips for the two displays. 16:9 on the LG, it's gonna work with basically everything, no problems. 21:9 on the other hand, doesn't work with everything. Well, it works, but I'll get to that in a second. Especially among recent games, you'd have a hard time finding something that doesn't support 21:9. That's not true for older games though, which are often locked to 16:9. You can typically find workarounds like Flawless Widescreen is a program that supports a few dozen games, but you may still encounter some titles that have black bars on the sides of the screen. Additionally, and this is where 21:9 starts to lose some luster for me, some games have elements that are locked to 16:9 even if the game is rendering at 21:9. It sounds a little confusing, but as an example, something like speed lines in Destiny 2 when you're sprinting. The game will still show up in 21:9, taking up the full screen, but there will be a hard cutoff on the edge for that HUD overlay. And almost universally, games that render in 21:9 have cutscenes that are baked at 16:9, so you'll be jumping back and forth between having black bars and not having them. There's also consoles to consider. If you don't have a PC, a 21:9 monitor really isn't gonna play well with your console, where everything is basically locked at 16:9. It's definitely not a deal breaker, just something to be aware of if you've only ever used 16:9 displays. On the flip side, 21:9 is much more immersive when it's working. That extra peripheral field of view makes a world of difference in a game like Final Fantasy XIV or Cyberpunk 2077, pulling you into the game world. It's something that a 16:9 display just can't match. I gotta be honest, I really prefer 21:9 for desktop use too. Now, neither of these monitors are great for extensive desktop use. The risk of OLED burn-in is present, even if it's a little overblown, and they can have some minor issues with text clarity due to having a white subpixel. Regardless, 21:9 really does wonders for productivity. Main reason is that you can have two windows side by side and still have a full view of them. They are nearly perfect squares, while on a 16:9 monitor, having two windows side by side, they're longer vertically than they are horizontally. Honestly, I couldn't live without a 21:9 monitor for work. It allows me to have an article or whatever I'm working on in one window while having a research window right next to it, and that's huge. The extra space does a lot in creative apps too. For example, you can see more of the timeline in Premiere Pro or Pro Tools. That doesn't mean the UltraGear OLED 27 is bad on the desktop, but it's certainly not as good as what an ultra-wide can offer. One final note on image quality is the coating. The UltraGear OLED 27 uses a matte anti-glare coating, while the Alienware 34 QD-OLED has a glossy finish. For being a matte coating, the UltraGear OLED 27 still looks super vibrant. The coating really doesn't get in the way, contrary to what you might read online. However, the glossy coating on the 34 QD OLED still looks better, even if that sometimes means dealing with harsher reflections. Before I get out of here, I need to make a note on controlling the monitors. I'll just get this out of the way up front. The Alienware wins. You can access the OSD through a joystick on the bottom, and you can quickly see what picture profile you're on, as well as your panel health. This is super helpful to remind you to use the built-in OLED maintenance features to prevent burn-in. LG has these same burn-in prevention features, but unfortunately no panel health option. Worse, you can't access the full OSD, including the burn-in prevention features, with the joystick. You have to use the included remote to access the menu. It's not a deal breaker, but it's definitely annoying. You should really be able to access the menu with the controls on the monitor itself, especially considering features like burn-in prevention are only available there. All right, time for some conclusions. I'll say it once again, you can pick up either of these monitors and you'll have a great gaming experience. They're both awesome. But the edge is definitely in Alienware's camp here. It has small advantages here and there, like a bump in brightness, a glossy coating, and a super useful OSD that collectively make it just a little better than the UltraGear OLED 27. You shouldn't ignore LG's monitor though. It still has its place, particularly if you play competitive games and don't want to fuss around with some of the oddities that 21:9 can bring. But hey, I want to know what you think. Do you agree that the Alienware is a better option, or does something stand out more about the LG for you? Let me know in the comments below. While you're down there, make sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video.